So, like I said, we could probably talk for many hours on each of these topics, but let's look at some of the battles, and maybe you
Yeah,
can
sure.
tell me which jumps out at you. I want to talk to you about the Western Front and definitely talk about Normandy. But so there was the Battle of Midway
Yep.
in 1942, which is a naval battle. There's Eastern Front, Stalingrad, probably the deadliest battle in human history. Then there's the Battle of Kursk,
Yep.
which is a tank battle, the largest tank battle in history, probably the largest battle period in history. 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, 4,000 aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And then that takes us also to the Battle of the Bulge in Normandy, the Italian campaign that you talk a lot about. So what do you think is interesting to try to extract some wisdom from before we get to Normandy? Do you find, as a historian, the Battle of Kursk or the Battle of Stalingrad more interesting? Stalingrad is often seen as the turning
Well,
point.
I think so. I mean, it's really interesting. So they get through 1941. Barbarossa doesn't happen as the Germans hope it will. The whole point is to completely destroy the Red Army in 3 months, and that just doesn't happen. And I think you can argue convincingly that by, let's say, the beginning of December 1941, Germany is just not going to win. It just can't. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So if you take an arbitrary date, let's say the 15th of June 1941, Germany at that moment has one enemy, which is Great Britain, albeit Great Britain plus Dominion Empire. Fast forward 6 months to, let's say, the 16th of December. It's got three enemies. It's got Great Britain, Dominion Empire, USSR, and the USA. It is just not going to win. For all the talks of wonder weapons and all the rest of it, it's just not going to. It has lost that battle. Having said that, the Soviet Union is still in a really, really bad situation. It is being helped out a huge amount by supplies from the United States and from Britain. Just unprecedented amounts of material being sent through the Arctic or across Alaska into the Soviet Union at that time. It is absolutely staggering how much is committed by Roosevelt and Churchill to try and stem the flow in the Soviet Union, because for all the announcements and the pride that the Soviet Union has about moving factories to the other side of the Urals and stuff, which they do in 1941, huge amounts are overrun intact by the Germans in the opening stages of Barbarossa. I mean, really, colossal losses, huge amounts. So, the grain is gone, coal is gone, entire factories have gone, steel production goes down by 80% in the Soviet Union in 1941 and into 1942. So in 1942, despite the vast amount of numbers of men that they have at their hands, I mean, they create 80 new divisions in the second half of 1941, for example. I mean, Britain never has 80 divisions in the entire Second World War, division being about, rule of thumb, 15,000 men. So, despite that, and that is because Stalin's meddling, the woeful state of the Red Army in 1941, et cetera, which we've already sort of touched upon. So 1942, it's still in a really bad way, but Germany's in a really bad way too. The attrition it's suffered in 1941, it's winning itself to death in 1941. So it's having these huge, great encirclements, like the encirclement of Kiev in September 1941, capturing a further best part of 700,000 Red Army troops, et cetera. But in the process of doing that, it is constantly being attrited, both in battle casualties, but in also mechanical casualties too. Just can't cope. It's just the scale is just too big. And what happens is, with every moment that the German forces, that ultimate victory slips away, so Hitler's personal handling of the battle increases. And, you can say what you like about him, but he just hasn't had the military training to do that. He might have amazing attention to detail. He might be able to understand, have an enormous capacity to remember units and where they are on a map. But he was only a half corporal in the First World War. He's never been to staff college. He might have read lots about Frederick the Great. I mean, I've read lots of history, but that doesn't mean to say I'd be a competent field marshal. So he is not the right person for the job at all. And he micromanages and he looks at figures and figures and doesn't understand what it's like at the actual front, the coalface. So he's stifling the very thing that made the German army effective, which is the ability to give commanders at the front the freedom on their leash to be able to make decisions and battle command decisions. And he's taken that away from them. So he's basically making them go into battle with decreasing amounts of supplies and firepower, and with one hand behind their back in terms of decision-making process. And that is not a good combination. The other problem is that he decides, rather than going for Moscow in 1942, because basically there's a kind of cooling off period in the winter because of the conditions. But everyone knows, the Soviet Union, the Red Army knows that the moment spring's come, there's going to be another offensive, be another major offensive in the summer. That is absolutely as certain as, day following night, etc. The problem that the Germans have is they just don't have enough. They have less than they had when they launched Barbarossa the previous year. The Soviet Union has more. It is better prepared. It knows what's coming now. It's kind of learning some of the lessons, starting to absorb the lessons. Stalin, coincidentally, is pulling back from his very tight leash in the way that Hitler is doing the opposite and increasing his micromanagement and control freakery. And what Hitler decides is, rather than going for Moscow, he's going to go for the oil fields. And this is absolutely insane, because what's going to happen when they get to the oil fields? I mean, does he think really that the Soviet Union are going to let those oil fields come into German hands intact? Even if he does let them get in intact, what are they going to do with that oil? I mean, oil needs to be refined. Where are you going to refine it? They don't have any oil. They don't have many oil refineries. How are you going to ship that oil to where you need it to be in the factories in the Third Reich and into your, process it into gasoline, and then get it, and diesel, and get it to your U-boats, get it to your tanks, get it to your armored units? How are you going to do that? How do you transport it from the Caucasus, which is a long, long way away from Berlin? How are you going to do that? There's no pipelines. There's only some pipelines. They've been built by American money and American engineering, and they're going backwards towards the Urals, not forwards. They have no more rail capacity whatsoever. They just don't have the oil tankers. So it is absolute la-la land. It is incredible that when you look at the detailed literature that the Germans have, no one is asking this question in the spring and early summer of 1942.
The logistics question in part.
No one is saying, okay, it's great that we're going to go to the Caucasus and get all this oil, but then what? No one is asking that question.
Nor how do you provide resources and feed and the soldiers and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
I mean, it's...
So the case blue, first of all, they get distracted by going into the Crimea, and they go, well, we've got to do that first. So they have to get Sevastopol and the Crimea, which they do. And then they have to push on. And at this point, suddenly looming in front of them is Stalingrad on the banks of the Volga, this city, this industrial city, which has Stalin's name. And Hitler goes, okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to split my forces. So half of you can go south towards the Caucasus, and the rest of you can confront Stalingrad. And von Bock, who's the commander, just goes, that's nuts. That makes no sense whatsoever. You're splitting the mission. So Hitler fires him. So suddenly they get into this assault for Stalingrad. And it becomes this sort of street fight. Street fighting is the worst kind of fighting. I mean, the reason why the Israelis have just blown everything up in Gaza is because otherwise you can't see. You need a field of fire. This is fighting in a build-up area is horrendous.
Yeah, to clarify, we're talking about urban warfare, door to door, building to building.
It's incredibly difficult, and home advantage is colossal in this instance. And of course, it's piping hot when they attack in kind of August into early September, and then it suddenly gets very, very cold. And at the same time, American mechanization, and slightly a British mechanization, but primarily American trucks, are enabling Zhukov to plan this great pincer movement. So it is, and Russians will hate me for saying this, and I probably will get a whole load of bots on the back of it. But the truth is it is not the street fighting that destroys Sixth Army. It is the encirclement, the subsequent encirclement. So the Germans have been sucked into this street battle in Stalingrad. We cannot give up. We cannot give up. We cannot back down. We cannot pull out. We've got to destroy this city. Meanwhile, while their backs are turned, and while most of their forces are going off to the Caucasus on a wild goose chase for absolutely zero oil, incidentally, and they never get remotely close to Baku, this huge great pincer movement is being planned, and it is only possible through mechanization from the United States. And that is the big turning point, because from that moment onwards, the Germans are on the back foot. They're basically going backwards. There are little small counterattacks. There is obviously the Kursk salient, for example, but it's game over. The catastrophe of the surrender of final. I mean, the writing's on the wall at the end of 1942. But by November 1942, when the two Soviet fronts meet up, then there is no possible chance of escape for Sixth Army. They are consigned. They are toast. And their final surrender obviously happens at the very beginning of February 1943. But that's all over. And then at the same time that is happening, disaster is unfolding in North Africa, because Hitler has insisted on massively resupplying the Mediterranean theatre. And the problem there is the amount of equipment that is lost in North Africa is greater than it is at Stalingrad. I don't think you could argue that psychologically Tunisia is a greater loss than Stalingrad. It absolutely isn't. But you have to see them in tandem, as this is two fronts. This is Eastern Front, Southern Western Front. And this is the first time that the Americans have been on the ground against Axis forces, and they lose big time. The Allies become masters of the North African shores on the 13th of May, 1943, and it is a catastrophe. And in that time, 2,700 Luftwaffe aircraft have been destroyed over North Africa between November 1942 and May 1943. And overall, there's subsequent that summer as well. It's really interesting. The Luftwaffe loses between June and October 1943. So this is including the Kursk battle, which takes place in July 1943. In that period, the Luftwaffe loses 702 aircraft over the Eastern Front, but 3,704 aircraft over the Mediterranean. So I think one of the lessons about studying the Second World War is one has to be careful not to assign strategic importance to boots on the ground. It can be of great strategic importance, but not necessarily. No one would argue, for example, that the Guadalcanal is not an absolutely game-changing battle in the Pacific War, and yet the number of troops compared to what's going on the Eastern Front or even the Western Front is tiny in comparison. So it is absolutely true that the most German blood is lost on the Eastern Front, but that doesn't mean to say that it's more strategically important than the Western Front. It's not saying that the Western Front is more strategic either. It's just you have to kind of be balanced about this. The psychological blow, though, of Stalingrad is immense, and you cannot belittle that.
I mean, we went over it really fast, but there is a human drama element.
Yes.
But yes, when we're talking about the operational side, the material loss of a battle is also extremely important to the big picture of the war. And we often don't talk about that because, of course, with war, the thing to focus on is the human drama of it.
Yes.
Because we're humans.
And I also think that what's interesting is the Nazi High Command's response to Stalingrad, which is not to go, we're screwed. It's to double down. It's, then so Goebbels, for example, gives his infamous speech in the Sports Palace in third week of February 1943, where he goes, are you ready for this? This is now total war. The war is coming. This is a fight for survival. We're all in it together. You are in this as well. Every single German is now, this is a fight for survival. And we are now in total war. And everyone is just so depressed by this. I mean,
yeah,
they realize that they are going to reap what they have sown.
Yeah.
Because everyone knows what's been going on the Eastern Front. Because first part of the war, Germans have loads and loads of cameras. They're really into photographing everything, taking cine footage of everything. It's all part of recording the greatness of the Reich and the triumphs of the Reich. They want it recorded. So all this stuff is a bit like the radios, is made very, very cheap. So lots of have it. And people are sending it all back. And, the people that are developing this stuff are all seeing it, and people are talking about it. And then it's being sent to families, and they're all seeing it. And they're seeing pictures of Jews being rounded up and beaten. And they're seeing Ukrainian partisans being executed, and they're seeing villages being torched, and everyone knows. They all know.
Yeah.
This whole idea is, did they really know what was going on? Yeah, they do. They do know what's going on. To lesser or greater detail, of course. There's some people who don't, and a bit like people know about the news today. Some people do, some people don't. I never read the newspaper. I never listen to the news. So you have that, of course. But it is widely understood and widely known that really brutal things have been going on in the East, and troops are coming back utterly traumatized by what they have taken part in, what they have witnessed, the kind of unspeakable brutality. This is war on a completely different level to anything that's been kind of seen in recent years.
Yeah, we should mention that, the Western Front and the Eastern Front are very different in this regard.
Yes.
So a lot of the Holocaust by bullets, the Holocaust with the concentration camps and the
Mhm.
extermination camps is not in Germany, is not in the Western Front, it's in Poland, it's in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but don't forget that even Auschwitz, for example, is part of the new Reich. It is part of, it is part of an area which has been absorbed into Germany. So as far as they're concerned, this has now got, it's now no longer got the Polish name. It's now called Auschwitz, which is a German name. It is
Yeah.
part of Germany. And there are German people moving there into this, air comma model town. And they all know exactly what's going on.